This is Chapter 1, Section 5, the aftermath of the Civil War. Okay, finally the Civil War is over. General Lee surrenders his Confederate Army to General Grant April 9th, 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. Yes, that's the name of a town. It wasn't an actual courthouse. Appomattox Courthouse is a town in Virginia. And little fun fact: the grounds in Appomattox Courthouse is actually the site of the first battle of the Civil War. So it was the first site of the first and last battle of the Civil War. Kind of worked out that way. All right. So, anyways, General Lee, he surrenders his about 20,000 soldiers that he had left in his Confederate Army over to the Union. And General Grant did not want to be harsh on these soldiers. He offered them pretty generous terms of surrender. No Confederate soldiers were taken prisoner at Appomattox Courthouse. All they had to do was lay down their arms and they could go home. They were allowed to take a horse with them, not only for mainly so they can bring it home so they can help plow the fields and get going. So a horse is very important. So it was great that the Union didn't take the Confederate soldiers' horses. And so when General Lee and his staff, when they were leaving, some of the men started to cheer like they were happy that the war was over. But General Grant stopped them and said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." That means that there's no reason to rub it in their face. It's they're our brothers again. They're part of the United States. We treat them as such. All right. So the war lasted for 4 years, across 5 Aprils, some people would say. So it started on April 12th, 1861, and almost 4 years exactly. Ended in April 9th, 1865. Way longer than anybody would have guessed at the start of the war. In total, 618,000 men died during the Civil War. 360,000 dead from the Union and 258,000 dead from the Confederate. There was 500,000 that survived the war, just survived the battle, but you can see here they didn't come back with everything. Missing arms, missing legs. A lot of disfigured men came back. But it was considered it's the deadliest war in American history by far. So if you look at this graph here, this is the amount of dead Civil War, World War II, World War I. So really, the Civil War was more than both World War II and World War I, and pretty much every war since World War II combined, like Vietnam War, Korea War, Gulf War, and then even like the latest war, the Afghanistan War. This war lasted 10 years, and that was only 6,000 dead. Compared to 4 years, 620,000. Like that was one battle. So just the amount of men that were killed in the Civil War was just amazing. All right, the South, after the Civil War, that was in ruins. Just wasn't a great place. Afterwards, many were homeless. Plantations and homes were burnt down. Thanks to Sherman's army, they pretty much just went into towns and just plundered everything and burned the fields. And their process of inflicting total war against the South, it was rarely effective. But the reality of it is after the war is over, that the South had this giant mess to clean up. So food and shelters were scarce. Men returning. So the men that were leaving the Confederate Army to come home after the war ended, they had no home to go to. The freed African American slaves had no place to go and no place to really work. So they, it's not like they had a resume or anything or a skill. Like they were, enslaved. So after they're enslaved, it's really like, where do we work? All right. So the reunification of the two nations. So after Lee surrenders, the Confederate States of America was no longer a nation anymore. It's like it was a nation for the 4 years and no longer a nation. The southern states, they couldn't just rejoin the Union. They had to go through a process. It wasn't like, okay, you're our friends again. Now you're part of the United States again. It was a bit of a process. There was still a lot of bad feelings, bad relations between the North and the South. They just spent 4 years battling each other, and so there's going to be some hard feelings. But President Lincoln wanted to heal the nation quickly. So President Lincoln came up with this 10% plan. It was a plan for the southern states to join the United States in a quick fashion. So all he was asking that 10% of the voting population of the South had to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States, and these voters could form a new state government. That's all they had to do, and they would rejoin the United States. 10% of the population of, say, Virginia just needed to say, hey, I'm loyal to the United States, swear an oath of loyalty, and they're good to go. Start a new state government and join the United States. But there was a catch. These new state governments would have to declare to end slavery, and then the state could send senators and representatives to the national government again. So as you see, this process wasn't exactly quick. By the time they get 10%, the population swear loyalty, form a new state government, declare that slavery was ended. The war ended in 1865. It took Texas 5 years. It took, Arkansas 3 years. Tennessee was pretty quick to action. Virginia took 5 years. So it wasn't an immediate thing. Hey, you're rejoining. It's like, no, you got to go through this process. Hey, we're going to behave. We're not going to have slavery anymore. We're going to agree with the United States. So this is relative to current events. This holiday known as Juneteenth. Really, the history of this happened right after the Civil War. So June 19th, 1865, the last group of enslaved African Americans were freed by the Union in Galveston, Texas. So pretty much, yes, the Emancipation Proclamation did free all the slaves in the South, but doesn't mean that the southern states listened to it or adhered to it. So it took a while for the Union soldiers to get into these areas and enforce this law. So there was this little spot near Galveston, Texas, that these people still had slaves, and they were the last little group to be freed, and it waited till these Union soldiers on June 19, 1865, to be like, hey, to these slave owners, that's enough. Slavery's not a thing. So that was the last group of slaves to be enslaved and to be free. So after that day, slavery officially ended in the United States. There was no slavery after that day. So it's now official national holiday commemorating, the last slaves being free. So, you have all these freed African Americans. What's the best way to help them? Well, the United States thought that educating them would be the best way to help them. And so the government set up a lot of these public schools in the South. Public schools in the South were scarce as it is, let alone public schools for African Americans. So a lot of Northern women went down and ran these schoolhouses and tried to educate African Americans, teaching them how to read, maybe and things of that nature, so they could join the workforce. Because before they were slaves, they didn't really, were taught really anything but to, work at the plantations. So now they need to be educated so they can have jobs. So Lee's surrender in Appomattox was April 9th, but 6 days later, or 5 days later, President Lincoln would be assassinated. Abraham Lincoln was not a popular president, if you remember, when he was elected in 1861. He actually won the election without the popular vote, but won enough electorates, but did not have a majority vote. By the end of the Civil War, Lincoln was a very well-liked president for obvious reasons that he freed the slaves in the South, he ended slavery, he led the North to victory, and he did not punish the South. He could have been really hard on the South and imprisoned many of their leaders and made them suffer, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted healing quickly. And then, really, to accomplish all these, Lincoln had this strong leadership qualities that is rare in presidents. Um, and he's considered one of the greatest American presidents in history. So, if not the greatest American president. So, just all these qualities, and that allow him to, lead the United States in probably the most, probably the hardest time to be a president in United States history. So, John Wilkes Booth, he was a semi-famous actor. He was well known in the theater circuits. He was living in Virginia, particularly Washington D.C., performing plays. Remember, there was no movies or anything like that. So plays, if you're a good theater actor, you're almost like a movie star. So he was, I'd say, like a B-list movie star. But he was a Southern supporter, and like any theater actor, he was dramatic. But he was angered by the South's loss in the Civil War and felt that he needed to do something about it. And he was also kind of ashamed of himself that he didn't fight for the Confederates in the Civil War. So Wilkes Booth and 7 others planned this assassination attempt on these high-ranking people in the United States, such as President Lincoln, General Grant, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State Seward. All right, so John Wilkes Booth and these 7 others were not great citizens. They kind of not very upstanding citizens, but he got together with. And so they were planning on doing this horrible thing by assassinating all these men at the same time on the same night. So like I said, this happened 6 days after, 5-6 days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. So Lincoln only got to enjoy his victory over the South for a very short period of time. So the location was Ford Theater, Washington, D.C. You can still go to this theater. I've toured it a few times, and they still have the booth where Lincoln was attending this play with his wife. And John Wilkes Booth knew how to sneak into the theater. He was a theater actor. He knew all the little ways to get in. So what happened was he came up behind Lincoln, and he knew the exact moment to come up behind Lincoln and fire a shot because he knew the play. And there was a scene in the play where a line was delivered and everybody laughed. So it was a good time for him. It was loud. Everybody's laughing. It was loud to sneak up behind him so he wouldn't hear him. And that's when he fired his pistol into President Lincoln's head. After he fired the shot, he jumped from the balcony, and then he landed on the stage, breaking his ankle, actually. And then after landing on the stage, he kind of, in his dramaticness, he kind of shouted to the audience, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is like death to tyrants, meaning that Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant. And then he says, "The South is avenged." So he thought, in his own dramatic fashion, that he kind of got some revenge for the South's defeat in the Civil War. So this is kind of like he actually had to have a dagger and a pistol in his hand. And he came up behind Abraham Lincoln and shot him. And so this is a good depiction of him jumping. He literally jumped up on the balcony onto the stage. President Lincoln died of his wounds, his headshot, just a few hours later. But it took 2 weeks to track down John Wilkes Booth, and he was shot dead in a barn. All Booth's associates that were, had the job of assassinating others that night were unsuccessful and didn't assassinate anybody else, but were charged with treason anyway and hanged. The nation was devastated after Lincoln's death. He was a popular president. He was kind of like the hero, and it was like seemed like he was the one to move the nation forward after the Civil War and to heal everything up. But his untimely death kind of changed everything. So it kind of brought a wet blanket over such a great time that the Civil War was over. Finally, the Civil War is over, and then the nation has this terrible thing that happened. He was considered the last casualty of the Civil War. Like I said, it just ended a few days before, and then Lincoln was shot, so he's considered the very last casualty of the Civil War. And then this funeral train here carried Lincoln's casket all throughout the North until it reached Illinois, where Lincoln was finally buried because that was his home state. But it toured all throughout the United States and the North, so people could pay their respects, and they gathered together in droves to pay their last respects. That is the end. And then Vice President Johnson became president, the new president of the United States after Lincoln's death. So that concludes Chapter 1, Section 5.